Once upon a time, when the mountains still rested their peaks against the sky, and the clouds glided between them like a weightless veil, at the foot of one of the mountains, in a dense forest, lived a woodcutter. Day after day, he did his job, was kind and sincere, but very lonely. The woodcutter loved the forest and its inhabitants. That's why one day he took pity on a wounded deer and hid it from the hunter. In gratitude for saving him, the deer decided to help the woodcutter overcome his loneliness by marrying the fairy. He advised the man to steal her wings while the fairy was bathing in the pond. Without wings, the fairy will not be able to return to heaven, and she will be able to get them back only after giving birth to 3 children. The woodcutter was delighted with the advice and hurried to the pond. There he chose the most beautiful of the fairies and stole her wings. Now the fairy was doomed to remain on Earth until she returned them. And so began this mysterious story. The dark-haired girl in the scarlet dress felt quite confident under the flashes of the lenses. It was natural because she was too beautiful. Numerous photographers circled around her like a swarm of bees, and each one did not fail to admire her perfect beauty. It was Jung Mo-ran, the obvious contender for the title of Actress of the Year. The girl was beautiful, like an angel descended from heaven. Meanwhile, not far away, in one of the restaurants, a warm group of friends was celebrating the approaching New Year. The sound of glasses clinking could be heard from everywhere. The friends were having a lot of fun. However, all the snacks had already been tried, and their youthful enthusiasm drove them towards adventures. Therefore, it was decided to change the restaurant. One of the young men was suddenly distracted by the buzzer of his mobile phone. The message on the screen said that the award ceremony for Best Actress was taking place right at that moment. The phones of the other friends started beeping right away. Messages came in without stopping. However, it quickly became clear that the phones were not the culprit behind the sharp sounds. The street was filled with alarm signals coming from the public address system. They were calling for the immediate evacuation of anyone in the vicinity of Rodeo Street. The danger was coming from the Bean Building. Raising their heads, the friends noticed that the building was not far away. It was decided to find out more about it. As they approached, the young men saw that the building was cordoned off with warning tape. Rumors were spreading among the crowd that a monster was operating in the Bean Building, killing 10 people. Fear gripped all those watching. After all, the monster resembled an ordinary person and could easily disappear into the crowd. Everyone began to look closely at those who stood nearby. All that was left was to guess whether the person in front of you was human. One of the young men spoke angrily towards the police. In his opinion, the law enforcement officers did not make enough efforts to catch the monster. Suddenly, he staggered slightly and grabbed his shoulder. The young man felt as if he had been hit by a stone. However, it was only a young man who had passed by. Turning around, he quickly apologized for pushing the stranger. The man was visibly agitated and in a hurry. The injured young man was about to respond rudely, but suddenly fell silent. He stood motionless and only looked dumbfoundedly into the face of the man who had pushed him. And he was already moving away in the direction of the Bean Building. The friends, left far behind, could only guess why this man was recklessly rushing towards danger. Meanwhile, rescuers received a signal that another victim of the monster was found on the 3rd floor of the building. All the bodies found were covered with terrible spots, resembling burns. One of the investigators examining the bodies complained that there were too many victims. Everyone eagerly awaited the arrival of Chief Investigator Sa Jae-ha, and he appeared completely unexpectedly, embarrassing his subordinates. They could only guess whether the boss had heard their unrestrained statements. However, Sa Jae-ha himself was a little embarrassed by his lateness. This was the same impetuous man who accidentally pushed the young man. Because of the huge crowd, he had to park too far away and walk. Now he wondered if measures had been taken to relieve the crush. To this, the detectives explained with annoyance that people did not realize the danger, so the crowd continued to grow. The citizens completely ignored the security system alerts. Looking at the growing number of victims of the monster, the investigator lamented that people were not informed enough. In fact, almost no one was immune to the infection. The man stood there, thinking, near one of the monster's victims. Suddenly, his eyes widened in horror. He saw the injured man's hand sticking out from under the cloak covering his body. The skin on it shimmered with a greenish light and was slightly smoking. This meant that very little time had passed since the attack, and the monster was definitely still nearby. Therefore, it was necessary to immediately take the other people away. Anyone who was infected with the Quiggy virus could become a monster. The infection spread very quickly, so being near the building was very dangerous. The deadly virus had been keeping people in fear for over a decade, but many did not realize the threat. And now, a group of young people were laughing and getting ready to film. However, the investigator could not allow this. He explained to the young people that almost no one in the population had immunity. Only the workers of the special headquarters could resist the virus. Therefore, the man resolutely demanded that they stop filming and leave. All entertainment had to be postponed until the monster was caught. The most terrible thing was that the criminal could be in a crowd of people, and no one could know who it was or what he looked like. People could start to suspect each other and see each other as an enemy. This could lead to increased aggression and unrest. Finally, some of the townspeople began to disperse. Some were clearly scared, but there were also those who thought that unnecessary panic was completely unnecessary, since even the police were doing nothing. The investigator heard how one of the guys even began to question his girlfriend, whether she was human, and she was seriously offended by the tactless young man. The couple began to quarrel. The investigator watched all this from the side and thought bitterly that this was not what he should be doing. They were wasting precious time. The man looked around and noticed an ambulance nearby. They were just loading a stretcher with one of the monster's victims into it. Doctors demanded to call the hospital so that they could prepare the intensive care unit. But the investigator saw that the victim's legs were also covered with terrible stains. He had seen the same on other victims before. No one knew what pain these people had gone through. After all, there had been no survivors of the attack. The man suddenly thought that even in such terrible conditions, life wins, and people strive to find a partner and build a relationship. He himself was not at all sure that he wanted such closeness with someone. In the face of a terrible threat, the man thought only about how to save the others. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a strange flash of green flame. It seemed to burst out of the building and rush towards the city center. The investigator called out to one of the detectives, Don Schick, and pointed in the direction. It was necessary to understand where the strange clot of energy was moving. Dong Schick replied that HBS was located there. It was the broadcaster responsible for the broadcast of the Actress of the Year award ceremony. Suddenly, they were interrupted by a phone call. Investigator Sa Jae-ha picked up the phone impatiently. The person on the other end of the line said that the monster had just attacked again during a live broadcast of the HBS awards ceremony. The investigator had to hurry. At this time, in the HBS building, everyone present froze in horror. No one could believe their eyes. The body of a young woman was spread out on the floor in front of the silent crowd. Her skin was covered with the now familiar, horrible spots. And suddenly the crowd began to buzz like a disturbed beehive. From the lips of each person present, only one name was heard. The thing is, the main star of the evening, Jong Mo-ran, was standing over the lifeless body, and it seemed like the crime was her doing. Now, numerous recent admirers looked at the beautiful girl with horror and indignation, but she was surprisingly calm and even serene. A little later, a real pandemonium could be observed near the central police station. It was here that the main star suspect was brought. The guards could barely cope with the frantic crowd of journalists. Questions rained down from all sides. Everyone wanted to know when the interrogation would end and demanded comments. And Chief Investigator Sa Jae-ha ran towards the building as fast as he could. As he ran, he managed to hear two detectives discussing the detained star. Seeing the boss, they stood up straight and saluted. But behind their backs, they continued to talk about the unreal beauty of the actress and dream of an autograph. The man waved off his subordinates and rushed into the building. He raced down the hallway until he saw the sign above the interrogation room. Sa Jae-ha threw the door open and literally stumbled in. Trying to calm his breathing, he looked around the room. Seeing a female figure inside, the investigator entered. He opened his mouth to say something, but then froze in place. At the same time, two detectives ran up to the station. Both were breathing heavily, so their colleagues realized that they had been running from the Bean building itself. One of them turned to his colleagues. He claimed that Mo-ran was incapable of killing anyone. They replied that the actress had not said a word yet, so no one knew anything. However, everyone saw that Chief Investigator Sa Jae-ha had already arrived, and they hoped that the situation would become a little clearer. At the same time, he was looking at the suspect in shock. The man couldn't believe what he was just seeing with his own eyes. After all, he knew the beautiful Moran too well. Now she was wearing a scarlet dress and expensive jewelry. Her loose hair flowed over her shoulders, and her eyes looked stern and sad. But he remembered her completely differently. She was dressed in a traditional kimono then, and her hair was adorned with an intricate hairstyle. But still it was she, the fairy from the pond. And not long before, Detective Dong-shik was very indignant. Almost shouting, he argued with Sae-ha that Moran could not possibly be the murderer. The chief investigator, sitting behind the wheel, listened to him calmly and imperturbably. And Dong-shik next to him did not stop being indignant and proving his case. He couldn't bear to hear his old friend accused of such a terrible crime. After all, everyone knew that the infected could not control their desire to kill. Then Sae-ha thoughtfully said that he also did not consider the beauty a murderer. There was no way she could be a monster capable of terrible crimes. This statement unexpectedly interested Dong-shik. He asked if the boss had met the star in real life. He didn't deny it and only briefly explained that he had indeed met Moran once, but it was too long ago. Much has changed since then. At the age of 18, the girl passed one of the castings, and over the next 10 years, she was able to build a dizzying career. Now every resident of South Korea knew this incredible beauty. She was undoubtedly the brightest and most talented actress of our time. Before the horrible incident, many people thought she was an angel who had descended from heaven. And Sae-ha quite agreed with them. And Dong-shik continued to babble, citing arguments in favor of the girl's innocence. The boss even had to interrupt him, reminding him that they had already arrived. And now, standing at the threshold of the interrogation room, the always unperturbed Sae-ha was about to lose his composure. He saw his fairy in front of him again. The man looked at this beautiful girl in national dress and thought that his fairy really did seem to have come straight from heaven. He could not think of any other explanation for her appearance. And suddenly the vision dissipated. The investigator even shook his head, trying to come to his senses. Just now he saw a charming fairy in festive attire. And now Moran was in front of him again, in a scarlet evening dress. He stuttered as he tried to ask the girl what had just happened. But she only looked at him in confusion. She said hello and said she had something she wanted to tell him. It wouldn't necessarily affect the investigation, but the girl still asked to listen. Sae-ha was so taken aback by what he saw or wanted to see that he could only nod his head in response. The words seemed to be stuck in his throat. Moran began to explain that half an hour ago, during the awards ceremony, there was a short break. The host asked everyone to gather again in 10 minutes. Moran's seat was next to Ma Hee-yeon's, a young and inexperienced actress. She was a nice girl, so Moran tried to support her young colleague. The star was a little older and had more experience. This year, she and Ma Hee-yeon starred in the same drama, playing sisters. The girls were not friends, but rather just said hello to each other. However, during the ceremony, Moran noticed that her young colleague was restless. During the break, the star decided to find out the reason for her anxiety. When Moran asked this girl a question, she even shuddered in surprise. But she quickly replied that she was just a little nervous and everything was fine. The star was not surprised by this answer. She decided that the excitement was explained by the fact that this was Ma Hee-yeon's first ceremony. Moran remembered her first award ceremony well and understood the young actress's feelings well. So, as a form of support, she suggested that she go outside for a while to get some fresh air. The girls went up to the terrace. Moran stopped, mesmerized by the beautiful view of the city at night. It was spoiled only by a little smoke, as if a building was burning somewhere. The star noticed that it was quite fresh outside, and it would soon get even colder. The actresses couldn't get sick, so she suggested returning to the pavilion early. Suddenly, she heard Ma Hee-yeon thanking her from behind her. The young actress's voice was strangely muffled. Moran turned to her. The girl said that the star had worked hard to get to the top. Ma Hee-yeon was grateful that she had helped her achieve mastery. The beauty noticed that it was difficult for the girl to speak, but wrote it off as excitement. Therefore, she replied that the young actress herself had to try hard to get into this world. Moran sincerely believed that Ma Hee-yeon was a natural-born star. Moreover, Her talent promised to become even brighter with time. But while the actress showered the girl with compliments, she just remained silent and only lowered her head lower and lower. Finally, squeezing her hands tightly with excitement, she spoke. The girl admitted that she wanted to tell something. Mo-ran raised her eyebrows questioningly, waiting for him to continue. And Ma Hee-yeon quietly said that she had seen something very strange recently, and this something was next to Mo-ran. Hearing this, the actress shuddered violently, and then, before her eyes, something began to happen to Ma Hee-yeon. There was an ominous rustling sound, and her clenched hands seemed to be covered in smoke. A moment later, the entire girl was enveloped in a thick black fog. It swirled around her, and she only raised her hands in fear. Mo-ran screamed, and the young actress began to cough terribly, choking. Unable to stay on her feet, the girl fell with a loud crash. Hearing the bustle and cries of the young actress, people began to run to the terrace. A minute later, there was already a whole crowd at the door. It so happened that all they saw was Ma Hee-yeon falling dead with a terrible sound, and Mo-ran standing over her motionless body. It all happened too fast, and now Hee-yeon was dead, and everyone present at the ceremony believed Mo-ran was her killer. Sitting opposite the investigator, the star said that she herself had recently seen stories on the news. She listened with horror about the terrible infected monsters. All sources claimed that the infected were extremely dangerous and needed to be gotten rid of. And now people considered Mo-ran to be one of them. According to the rules, the monster had to be destroyed on the spot. However, in some cases, when doubts arose, the suspect was detained. And now investigator Sa Jae-ha thought that it would be very difficult to restrain the famous actress while observing all the rules for handling a monster. After all, she was admired by thousands of people. Suddenly, the man noticed how the beauty's eyes filled with tears. He froze in surprise, not knowing how to react to this. The detective, frozen, looked at the girl opposite, and she quietly asked for a napkin to wipe away her tears, apologizing for her weakness. The girl even had to repeat her request twice. Finally, Jae-ha came to his senses and asked her to wait a minute. He opened the door to the corridor, where his subordinates rushed towards him from all sides. Don Shik was holding out a box of tissues, and another detective wanted to say something in private. It was not quite opportune, but the guy was persistent. Then Jae-ha asked Dong Shik to take the napkins to the actress. He himself was about to listen to the annoying subordinate. But Don Shik did not move from his place. The investigator even had to repeat the request louder. Then Don Shik, flushed with embarrassment, moved toward the office door. When Jae-ha finally approached the detective, he quietly said that the actress should be put down quickly. By that time, a huge crowd of people had already gathered on the street. There were residents of neighboring houses, reporters, and famous bloggers. Since the police had not yet given any comments, people believed that the girl had been detained without reason. Many people were outraged by this, which greatly inflamed the situation. So the detective asked if the investigator had any real suspicions about her. Jae-ha responded sharply that he was going to let the girl go home immediately. In his opinion, she did not arouse any suspicions at all. Meanwhile, Dong Shik entered the office and handed Mo-ran a box of tissues. She only looked up at him, but the young man was already trembling with excitement. The girl quietly thanked him, and Dong Shik looked at her tired but beautiful face and saw tears on her long eyelashes. The unattainable star seemed very unhappy at that moment. Apparently, on that day, everyone around was enchanted by her beauty. Therefore, everyone wanted to believe in her innocence, not wanting to see anything else. And of course, investigator Jae-ha could not know that a few minutes before this, his subordinate had received a very important call on his phone. To talk to him, he even had to go out onto the stairs. The detective tried to calm his interlocutor. He promised to get the beautiful actress out immediately after the interrogation was over. However, his interlocutor was already shouting, demanding that this be done immediately. According to him, the chairman of HB Group himself asked for the girl's release. Therefore, the caller demanded that the detective immediately deal with the investigator and get Chung Mo-ran out. Otherwise, he promised the detective big trouble. So now, hearing from Jae-ha that the girl would soon be free, the detective finally calmed down. So far, everything was going well. However, he couldn't help but wonder where the actress got such important patrons from. And the detective had an unbearable desire to find out who Jong Mo-ran really was. And the beauty herself, who had caused so much controversy and discussion, was looking at her hands at that time. She clenched her fists so hard that her nails left bloody marks on her palms. The girl shuddered and began to rub her hand against her dress. The blood was not visible at all on the bright red fabric. She tried her best to restrain herself, and only mentally convinced herself that the time had not yet come. She needed to be patient a little. The girl frowned and looked at her watch. Her eyes were burning with an unkind fire, and her dress cast red reflections on her face. Mo-ran stared at the clock on the wall. There was very little time left. There were only 29 minutes left until the new year, and they were ticking away. The city was ablaze with lights and preparing to welcome the new year. In every apartment, every office, and every hotel room, people were looking at the clocks that were counting down the last minutes of the old year. Meanwhile, the HB Electronics Corporation office was still in full swing. Although most of the staff had already gone home, Chairman Shin Hyo-ryung was still there. The secretary quietly opened the door, which barely creaked, and brought in a tray with a cup of freshly brewed coffee. The chairwoman was having an important telephone conversation. She had just told her interlocutor about a VIP meeting where guests would greet the first dawn of the new year. A hike in the mountains was planned for this purpose. The secretary placed the quietly clinking cup on the table so as not to disturb his boss. But she was still enthusiastically talking about the organization of the holiday. Suddenly, the woman burst out laughing. She was amused by the fact that her interlocutor could not find plane tickets because they had all been sold out 2 months ago. With visible pleasure, Chairman Shin Hyo-ryung assured her opponent that this was no problem for her at all. The woman clearly enjoyed feeling all-powerful. She assured the man that she would be happy to resolve the matter and that he would be given the best room at the hotel. Seeing the secretary's questioning look, the chairwoman nodded briefly. Taking the cup, she firmly said that this was a great opportunity for the company to stand out. After all, senior management rarely attended such events. Noticing that it was already quite late, she began to get ready. And she instructed her secretary to prepare a room in the corporate hospital. Someone very important might need hospitalization. The woman finished her coffee and slammed the cup down on the table. Suddenly remembering, she asked the secretary how the selection of security personnel was going. He immediately replied that 6 people from the Special Forces unit had already been selected. Each of them already had immunity to the virus. The secretary suggested that the chairman would be guarded by 4 people, and 2 more for actress John. However, the woman said that each of them would need 3 guards. She looked through the file of the security candidates once more and placed the file on the table. Shin Hyo-ryung's face showed concern. She understood that no one could know what would happen in the morning. The first dawn of the new year could bring completely unexpected events to Jong Mo-ran. At the same time, an angry crowd was making noise near the city's central police station. Everyone wanted to know why everyone's favorite was detained. Many people were holding their mobile phones. Young people were trying to track every mention of Mo-ran online. Here and there, you could find cautious mentions of the award ceremony. 2 young men, manager Choi Mi-hyuk and stylist Yoo Jin, stood waiting at the back entrance. Both were in tears and were wailing pitifully, repeating the star's name. And just at that moment, she appeared from an inconspicuous door and stared in amazement at the crying young people. Jong Mo-ran deliberately used the back door to disappear unnoticed. But the boy and girl immediately rushed to her with alarmed cries. They wanted to know immediately what had happened and also offered their help. The actress gratefully accepted the cape offered by the young man and sheepishly thanked him. And the investigator who came out after her sheepishly reminded her that she might still be needed as a witness. After some hesitation, he handed the star his phone and asked for her number. It was natural enough to keep her updated on the investigation, but it seemed a little odd. Mo-ran must have thought the same thing and turned around in surprise. Then the investigator asked her to give him her manager's number or her office phone. However, the girl, after thinking, answered that the matter directly concerned her colleague and herself. Therefore, she decided to give her personal number. She moved toward Jae-ha, but suddenly staggered slightly. One of her luxurious, glittering shoes caught on the hem of her scarlet evening dress. To keep from falling, the girl grabbed the investigator's hand and literally collapsed into his arms. He froze in surprise. The man was about to breathe a sigh of relief, having managed to catch such an important bird. But suddenly, his eyes widened in amazement. The thing was, his nose suddenly caught a faint scent of fresh blood. Lowering his head, Jae-ha saw that the girl was still holding his hand. A moment later, she was already on her feet and moving away from him. The man asked worriedly if everything was okay with her, and he himself kept wondering if he had imagined it. And then he could hardly believe his ears. The unattainable beautiful star was asking him if they had met before. Investigator Jae-ha was too confused to notice that the phrase sounded a bit forced. This question had been asked of each other by the heroes of many films. The man thought about what Mo-ran had seen before. However, it had been so long ago that it seemed like a dream. At that time, the famous actress was still just a beautiful girl surrounded by admirers. She could not remember the simple young man, so it could not be called a meeting. Therefore, the investigator hastened to answer that an ordinary detective had nowhere to meet a superstar. After all, she was always and everywhere surrounded by real crowds of fans. The girl sighed in disappointment. However, she immediately looked at her palms. Quite unexpectedly, she experienced some familiar feeling. A few minutes later, having seen the actress off, the investigator also went home. He said goodbye to his subordinates and wished those who remained on duty a successful shift. Walking through the streets at night, Jae-ha wondered if he should move to a new place. The new place was not as convenient, but it was closer to work. The journey now took only 15 minutes on foot. So, given the traffic on the roads, the car was increasingly left parked near the house. Now the man consoled himself with the fact that walking was good for his health, and the fresh night air helped cool his overheated head. He recalled how the previously unattainable star had almost found itself in his arms. Now everything that had happened seemed unreal. Jae-ha thought about the girl's unexpected tears and how he suddenly saw her in her national dress. Suddenly he realized that his imagination simply could not cope with her otherworldly beauty. And now the man regretted that he had not told the actress how much he had liked her latest film. Although, after thinking about it, he decided that it was better to remain silent so as not to say too much. After all, her beauty had a completely intoxicating effect on him. The girl resembled an exquisite flower, alluring with its aroma. As he got closer to his home, the investigator was already dreaming of going to bed right away. This day had been too full of work and had left him pretty tired. One only had to remember the billowing green smoke rushing through the city. This alone could not be considered an ordinary event. Jae-ha thought that all this must have been somehow connected to the award ceremony. But for now, it was completely unclear how to look for the real killer of the young actress. And suddenly, he noticed that similar green smoke was swirling nearby again. After all, the man had recently seen something similar. At first, the smoke was very close. However, upon closer inspection, Jae-ha noticed that its source was in an alley nearby. Almost immediately, a desperate cry for help was heard from there. The man jumped up. He simply had to check. Running around the corner of the house, Jae-ha put his hand under his jacket, feeling for his gun. But he remembered that he had removed the holster before interrogating the actress. Then he decided to try at least to use a stun gun to detain the criminal. However, the investigator could not even imagine what was waiting for him around the corner of the house. The scene that opened up before him made him freeze in amazement. Right before his eyes, Mo-ran, still dressed in an evening dress, was punching the man who was sprawled out in front of her with all her might. The man's face was already covered in blood. He stammered, asking the girl to stop, to spare him, and saying that he had made a mistake. However, the beautiful Mo-ran seemed to be possessed by a devil. She continued to strike blow after blow, until the knuckles of her fists were already stained with the blood of the victim. Suddenly, the girl raised her head, noticing the detective. He noted with surprise that a lit cigarette was smoking between her lips. Investigator Jae-ha was speechless. He was so shocked by what he saw that he froze in place. Mo-ran stared at him, and the man seemed to have stopped breathing. Suddenly, the girl released her grip on the victim's hair. The crippled man fell unconscious to the ground at her feet. Looking at him, the girl smiled slightly and sighed with satisfaction. It seemed that this battle had given her even more strength. Mo-ran took the cigarette out of her mouth and blew out smoke with relief. She regretfully noticed that the victim's blood had stained her face. Taking a final drag on her cigarette, she threw the butt on the ground and crushed it with the toe of her shoe. The detective remained silent, unable to come to his senses, and the actress said with regret that her current shell was too beautiful to be spoiled. At the same time, Jae-ha suddenly noticed that her shoes began to change before his eyes. Hearing the beep of the clock, the man mechanically glanced at the dial. It was exactly 12 o'clock at night on the 1st of January. The new year had arrived. Suddenly, he heard the girl say that everything was the same as before. Looking up, Jae-ha was stunned again. Before him stood the fairy again, dressed in a luxurious traditional outfit. Her eyes were flashing lightning. The girl said angrily that the fairy had been locked in the human world for 1,000 years, and she was still being persecuted. And then, investigator Jae-ha seemed to be transported back in time, 10 years ago. He was a student at Manhwa High School again. The grown man looked at the tall guy in the blue tracksuit from the side. He was very depressed. He sat on the steps of the school building next to his friend. The young man said that he had been seeing strange things lately. At first, the friend didn't pay attention. He tried to turn it into a joke and said it was just the excitement of entering high school. However, young Jae-ha insisted. Recently, more and more often, when he was in a crowd, he saw signs of possession in some people. However, all this was far from the first time. The young man remembered that he had already encountered something similar in his childhood. As a child, he loved to go to the forest, which was located right behind the house. There, the boy saw what he thought was a deer or an elk. But later he realized that these were not animals at all. Now in high school, everything was repeating itself. The young man began to see something similar even at home. Even when he returned home earlier than usual, he could see the strange green smoke. It seemed impossible to hide from it. The last time young Jae-ha saw him was just a few days ago. Sometimes it even seemed to him that the green reflections had settled in his eyes forever. However, the young man had no one to talk to about this, and only now did he dare to share it with his friend. But even here, a strange reaction awaited him. Kong Ming assumed that Jae-ha was simply overtired while preparing for the qualifying match. That's why he was experiencing the usual hallucinations. He didn't listen to the young man's objections. Instead, he added that a body with strange marks was found near the school. According to rumors, they were left by victims of infected attacks. Kong Ming noticed that such news could provoke the intensification of hallucinations and suggested that his friend keep a low profile for now. But Jae-ha was offended by the suspicions of madness. At the same time, the young man wanted to learn more about the strange infection, considering the situation to be quite serious, but his friend continued to joke about it. He even promised to become a doctor and cure his friend's mental disorder. Kong Ming was absolutely sure that he had a problem with his head. Oddly enough, the friend kept his promise and a year later entered the preparatory department of the medical university. However, due to his wild lifestyle, he was soon expelled. Jae-ha himself passed the selection round for the national team. One of the tests revealed that he was immune to the virus. Thanks to this, the young man received an offer to enroll in the police academy. Studying was not easy at all. Often I had to stay up all night without sleep. And naturally, the hallucinations did not go away. On the contrary, Jae-ha began to see the ominous green smoke much more often. It was as if this harbinger of horror was haunting him. Over time, it became increasingly difficult to bear. It seemed that the ability to foresee the crimes of green smoke had become much more acute. But now it had gone too far. The girl in the national costume who had appeared in place of Mo Ran was a fairy. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Dumbfounded, Jae-ha barely audibly whispered that he saw a fairy. His body was shaking violently, and his face was covered in cold sweat. From the outside, it might seem that nothing strange was happening. It was just that in a dark alley, a young man and a beautiful girl in a scarlet dress were standing opposite each other. From somewhere far away came the noise of a metropolis that did not sleep even at night. However, the girl still heard the spoken words. Her eyes widened. It was a beautiful yet terrifying sight. A girl of incredible beauty, her face and hands stained with the blood of her victim. She slowly walked towards the detective. The only sound in the silence was the soft clicking of her heels. As she approached, Mo Ran asked the man what he had just said. Jae-ha couldn't move from the spot from the unexpectedly revealed truth. It was absolutely impossible to believe that the terrible monster was the actress Mo Ran. With incredible effort, the man ordered himself to pull himself together. After all, it didn't matter at all who stood before him. A beauty, an actress, or a simple girl. It seemed that she wasn't human at all, and seeing a terrible monster in front of him, Investigator Jeha was obliged to destroy it. The man pulled out a shocker from his pocket and pressed the button. A loud crack of discharge was heard. However, suddenly, an unknown force seemed to knock the stun gun out of his hand. It flew far to the side. Having fallen into a puddle, the device made a final weak crack and fell helplessly silent. It seemed that it could no longer be useful. Jeha looked up and saw Mo Ran approaching. Her face twisted in anger, demanding that he repeat his words. The girl angrily asked how he was able to find her, and Jeha was finally able to ask what she had just done. To this, the actress scornfully remarked that she had tried to divert suspicion from herself, but the police hounds were trying very hard to find the killer. Hearing this, Jeha grimaced in displeasure. He could not forgive himself for casting aside his suspicions about the beauty, enchanted by her charm and charisma. Then Mo Ran said that he would have to wait a little while. At this, the girl clenched her fists again and walked towards the unconscious victim. But suddenly she turned around and looked at the man again. Smirking smugly, she added that he would be next. And then something happened to the detective. He suddenly remembered that he was an excellent athlete and even made it to the national team. His training helped him a lot during his studies as a detective. Jeha's excellent physical condition gave him an additional advantage, so he suddenly jumped towards Mo Ran and applied a chokehold. The detective squeezed the girl tighter and tried not to think about the consequences. First of all, he had to stop the dangerous criminal. At the same time, Jeha seemed to see the lifeless body of Ma Hee-yeon, a young actress whose career was cut short at the very beginning. He had to stop the monster to avoid more victims. While holding Mo Ran, the detective looked at the unconscious man to see if he was alive. He suddenly noticed a familiar green smoke swirling around him. Shocked by this discovery, Jeha watched as the green vortex grew stronger. There was no longer any doubt that its source was precisely the man lying motionless. Indeed, the detective remembered that he had not seen who was emitting the green glow when he ran into the alley. And at that time, the deadly energy was emanating from the intended victim. But then it became completely unclear who Mo Ran was. Everything pointed to her, but she did the opposite. She dealt with the monster. At that moment, a crack was heard, and the girl twisted out of Jeha's hands. He tried to grab her again, but his hands felt only air. The girl was unusually agile and dodgy, and the freed actress smiled with satisfaction and said that she remembered something. She allegedly said it 10 years ago. Grabbing the detective's hand, she recited the phrase about him being the first person to cut off her oxygen. It sounded oddly familiar to Jeha. He pulled his hand away, which surprised the girl greatly. The beauty noted with surprise that no one had ever managed to defeat her before, and then she continued that she could also show him something interesting. Her tone sent shivers of fear down Jeha's spine. He realized that the beauty had decided to finally deal with the lying man, and he didn't want to look at it at all. And then suddenly a bright light flashed. Covering it with his hand, the detective could see that it was just a very bright flashlight, and it was being held by one of the patrol police officers. The two of them just entered the alley. The luminary immediately recognized senior investigator Jeha and greeted him. He said that the patrol heard suspicious sounds from the alley and decided to check it out. The policeman asked what Jeha was doing there alone. The detective looked around in confusion and noticed that Mo Ran had strangely disappeared. Only a little further away, the man was still lying motionless on the ground. The detective replayed the events of the last half hour in his mind. He clearly saw Mo Ran beating her victim. But now she was not here. Jeha clearly remembered how he pulled his hand away. Even on his jacket, there was a mark from the girl's nails. So everything that happened could not have been a simple hallucination. He recalled her eyes burning with rage and her terrible blows again and again, while the patrolman unsuccessfully called him, lost in his thoughts. Finally, the investigator looked at them, and then he grimaced with displeasure, seeing the same expression on the faces of both patrolmen. It looked like they didn't believe in the presence of a third person in that alley, so there was no point in trying to tell them about the actress's amazing disappearance. Jeha slammed his fist against the wall of the house in frustration. It was hard for him to control himself given the current circumstances. And what irritated the man most was the uncertainty. He still couldn't figure out who Jung Mo-ran was. And her recent mysterious disappearance only made everything even more confusing. The one he couldn't stop thinking about was not far away at this time. As soon as he left the alley, he could see an inconspicuous gray building, one of many. Only one small detail distinguished him from the others. It was a bright red spot, which on closer inspection turned out to be fabric flowing in the wind. Yes, it was her. The beautiful Jung Mo-ran, still dressed in a scarlet evening gown, sat on the low parapet that ran around the roof of the building. The light fabric flowed in the wind, and her black hair was scattered over her shoulders. With an enigmatic smile, the beauty quietly repeated the detective's name, as if tasting it. This New Year's Eve was very different from all previous ones. Never before had the main event of the year, the awards ceremony, been marred by such a terrible incident. The murder of a young, talented actress has caused a lot of talk. But even more interest has been attracted by the figure of the main suspect, everyone's favorite Jung Mo-ran. The first news broadcast of the new year focused on this alone. The news that the actress of the year could be a murderer shocked people. No one dared to say it out loud, but many wanted the terrible assumption to be confirmed. After all, it promised completely unexpected turns of the investigation. However, by January 2nd, all reports of the actress's involvement in the murder had disappeared from the news feeds. At the same time, an important meeting was held at the police station. Along with the detectives, the highest-ranking officials were also present in the conference room. And they were all extremely dissatisfied with the progress of the investigation. The detectives tried to justify themselves by saying that there was a certain protocol for meeting a monster. However, the authorities did not allow the idea that the actress could kill a person during a break. And although investigator Jae-ha did not deviate from the rules one step, he was blamed for all the fuss that followed the arrest of the star. The man had to take the rap for everyone. At the end of the meeting, the chief ordered investigator Jae-ha to go to the bin building to deal with the aftermath of the fire. There was no need for him at the station. This statement sounded like an end to the investigation. Jae-ha tried to object. He noted that the latest case was very different from the others. This time, the monster managed to kill the victim without touching her body, which is why there were no visible marks left on it. Seeing that the boss wasn't listening to him at all, Jae-ha clenched his fists in frustration. He really wanted to tell all the new details that he had discovered in the alley. However, the leader suddenly said, looking the detective in the eye, that the identity of the real criminal was no longer that important. Jae-ha thought he had misheard and asked again, and the boss explained that the death of a young actress in the wake of public interest was not so important. The public was most interested in this story in Mo-ran. At first, everyone was really interested in the monster, but over time, the interest died down. And now, everyone really wanted a connection between the movie star and the horrible murders. The depressed detective, Jae-ha, noticed that he could not and did not want to back down. Then the chief, softening, explained that the management did not want this either. But there was no choice. At the same time, the culprit of all the heated arguments and discussions casually opened the yellow folder. It contained a selection of all the articles and materials dedicated to the star for that day. The assistant who brought the file reported that the police investigation had been suspended. As a thank you for his loyalty, the police chief was also invited to a celebratory event. Looking through the party script, Mo-ran noticed that 3 important committee members were expected to arrive. Therefore, attending the dinner was also included in her to-do list. The assistant then handed the actress a dainty, gold-glittered figurine, the Actress of the Year award. HBS handed it to the star after the event. In addition, the girl said that the company was planning to organize a special 20-minute episode dedicated to Mo-ran and her career. This was supposed to appease the hurt actress. Hearing this, the beauty smiled with satisfaction. Now she looked quite pleased and even noticed that all the long years of work had not been in vain. And then the assistant almost ruined everything. She rashly declared that the work was not so hard. This could not fail to anger the star. She immediately frowned and ordered the girl to step aside. She turned pale, but Mo-ran immediately said cheerfully that she was joking. The actress even suggested that the assistant take the prize for herself. After all, she had planned to do this from the very beginning if she won. The girl couldn't believe what she heard out of surprise, and Moran boasted of her excellent mood. After all, for the first time in a long time, she was interested in a man. She took a cigarette out of the pack and struck a lighter. Inhaling the aromatic smoke, the actress said that she was not going to back down this time. Of course, the man who caught the superstar's attention was senior investigator Seo Jae-ha, and he was not in the best of moods. At that very moment, he was walking towards the exit of the police station, heading towards the bin building. Detective Dong-shik caught up with the chief, asking for directions. He replied grimly that they should follow orders, but it was already clear that after an accurate count, the number of victims in the bean building could be much higher than expected. However, at this point, they could no longer help the unfortunate people. Because of this, Jae-ha felt completely useless. The situation was made worse by the complete lack of evidence. This, coupled with the fact that the authorities were planning to hush up the matter, suggested that Moran would seek revenge on Jae-ha personally. For some reason, this thought unpleasantly struck the always fearless investigator. A previously unknown feeling of fear visited him for the first time and made him seriously alarmed. Previously, a man always felt quite confident. Weapons and excellent physical training served as reliable protection. However, after the incident in the alley, Jae-ha suddenly realized that he was facing a more powerful force. He was unable to deal with Jung Mo-ran. Absorbed in sad thoughts, the investigator did not immediately hear the question of Detective Dong-shik, and the latter was interested in what to do with the planned interrogation of witnesses. To this, Jae-ha replied with annoyance that the entire city had already seen the news that the star had been hospitalized due to overwork. Given this, interrogation was becoming completely impossible. After all, it has happened many times before that criminals endowed with power and money have escaped responsibility, and often the pretext for this was imaginary illnesses. The investigator couldn't help but look at his hand, which was still aching from the time Moran had scratched it. He thought that he had received a small injury, but the actress had immediately rushed to the hospital. At this time, the detectives were just passing the storeroom in the hallway. Suddenly, a loud voice came from behind the door, mentioning HB Group. The men stopped. Listening closely, they heard a male voice telling someone about the call from the chairman of HB Group. The speaker was shocked that such an important person would ask him for a favor. He went on to say that he was very happy, because just in time, the squad leader himself decided to abandon the investigation. So Jae-ha, who was that commander, raised his eyebrows in surprise, and the speaker continued to be surprised that the chairwoman had made such a fuss by calling him personally. After all, cases of this magnitude had never been left unsolved before. And then the second male voice replied that since Commander Seo had closed the investigation, it meant that nothing serious had been found. Then the interlocutors allowed themselves a few dirty jokes. So Jae-ha was surprised to hear that he was considered his father's protege at the police station. They believed that thanks to his father, he had been released from service and had received a cushy job in the police force. The unfair and shameful assumptions made the detective blush with anger. The man could barely control himself from indignation, and then he noticed that Detective Dong-shik was trying to disappear unnoticed. He had almost turned the corner when the investigator ordered him to stand still. Something occurred to him. Jae-ha knew that Detective Dong-shik was a longtime admirer of Moran and could tell a lot about her. Indeed, he revealed that Moran's apartment was registered to Chairman Shin Hyo-ryung. The women were also often seen together at lunch or dinner, and they even returned to their apartments together. Such behavior would have been natural if the chairman had been a man. However, there was something clearly connected between the actress and the chairman of HB Corporation. However, no one knew any details. This was all that Dong-shik could say about the actress. The confused detective watched as investigator Jae-ha carefully wrote down his every word. Only then did he dare ask why it seemed like a secret meeting. In response to this, the man simply laughed it off. But it was clear that his head was working hard on the facts he had received. He even tried to depict everything he had heard in the form of a diagram. From it became clear that the women were connected by something more than ordinary friendship. Suddenly, Jae-ha thought that Chairman Shin Hyo-ryung could be a cover for Moran and provide her with safety and peace of mind, although the woman's motive was still unclear. And suddenly it dawned on him. An idea came into his head, so clear and simple that it was incomprehensible how he hadn't thought of it before. The man remembered Mo Ran's incredible strength and fury when she beat the man in the alley. The girl was clearly stronger than any monster. What she did made it seem like her power could kill all those creatures that kept people in fear. But then it turned out that she was not a villain at all, but a heroine. The investigator knew he couldn't help but get to the truth. But the investigation was closed, and he didn't even know how to meet the unattainable Mo Ran now. Jae-ha closed his eyes tiredly. But then something suddenly happened. A strange image appeared in the man's head. As if in reality, he saw Mo Ran, dressed in a crimson turtleneck and a white cloak, standing in front of him, smiling. The detective's eyes widened in amazement, but the vision did not disappear. He still saw the beauty standing before him. But this simply could not be real. A moment later, the vision dissipated and disappeared without a trace. Then the man decided that he had some kind of premonition. Still pondering the strange event, the tired detective went to bed, and the next morning, he set off again towards the station. For the first time in years, his commute to work was not a joy. Jae-ha had been working without a day off for 10 days, and had only received a suspended investigation. It had devastated him. And now the investigator was trying to decide what to do next. Duty told him to do his job and keep catching monsters, but he simply didn't have the strength. Suddenly, his mobile phone rang in his backpack. Without even looking at the screen, Jae-ha put the phone to his ear. It was the faithful Dong-shik. Almost without listening, the investigator said that he would be there soon and would enter through the back door. However, Dong-shik was simply shouting something unintelligible. He was demanding that the boss hurry up and come immediately. In the background, there was an incredible noise and hubbub. Jae-ha was puzzled. He couldn't even imagine that the always calm and quiet Dong-shik was capable of such a display of emotion. It was completely unlike the guy. Approaching the station, the man was surprised to hear many noisy voices. These were joyful cries, and they were coming from the police station building. The investigator assumed that his subordinates were watching football, wildly rejoicing. When suddenly, upon entering, he saw Mo Ran in front of him. The girl was wearing the same sweater and white coat as in his vision. The dumbfounded detective could only ask why she had come. He could not believe that he was seeing before him exactly what Providence had shown him yesterday. And the girl waved her hand lightly and smiled tenderly. She looked calm and peaceful, not at all like the evil fury she had been just a short time ago. Mo Ran reminded him that he himself had said that he wanted to see her again. Jae-ha just stared at her in surprise. He actually said that, but only before he met the bloodthirsty Mo Ran in the alley. After that meeting, only a suicide could have dreamed of seeing each other again. But now, before him stood a beautiful girl with a charming voice that drove him crazy. The detective recalled her asking if they had met before. That was right after she had been released from police custody following questioning. He simply could not succumb to her charms again. Meanwhile, the crowd of journalists and onlookers gathered in the hall demanded details. The seasoned investigator suddenly felt like a greenhorn who met a movie star in front of his school. And that was not something to be proud of. The man stuttered that he had said nothing of the sort. At the same time, he was thinking that for someone hospitalized due to overwork, the girl looked surprisingly healthy. He didn't know what else to expect. Perhaps he should even start to be wary of deserted alleys. And Mo Ran, smiling broadly, reminded him that she had to testify as a witness. Jae-ha looked at her silently. He still couldn't figure out her game and understand why the actress came to the police station. Having high-ranking patrons, she could not help but know that the investigation was closed. But for some reason, she came anyway. It was incredibly noisy around. The bustling visitors and police officers made it difficult to concentrate, so the investigator invited the actress into the interrogation room. It was not safe to be alone with her, and Jae-ha knew it. However, he placed his hopes on the camera on the ceiling, which should prevent an attack. However, another surprise awaited him here. Upon entering the room, investigator Jae-ha saw another girl. She introduced herself as lawyer Lee Yu-yeon and represented the interests of Chung Mo-ran. Smiling, the girl assured that the investigator could talk about everything in her presence. This was a rather unexpected move. Sitting down at the table opposite the girls, the detective began to look at them carefully. He tried to understand why Mo Ran had come with an escort. Previously, All her actions indicated that the girl was seeking a personal conversation. Now she only reported that she had already been discharged from the hospital and was feeling well. However, she complained that she still had trouble formulating her thoughts. That's why she brought her lawyer with her. The detective had no choice but to note that the actress looked quite healthy. He even noted with feigned joy that he had been worried about her condition. Apparently, Moran had figured out his game, because she also asked sympathetically if the detective was very worried about her. However, there was a smile in her eyes, and then suddenly something subtly changed. It was as if an arctic cold blew into the room. Jae-ha looked up and met the icy gaze of the female lawyer. She stared straight into his eyes without blinking. It was so strange and incomprehensible that the investigator quickly looked down. He rustled the papers on the table, making notes on the forms. At the same time, the man feverishly tried to understand what he had just felt. After all, just recently the lawyer had been nice and looked very professional. Now Jae-ha didn't understand anything at all, and he still couldn't guess the real reason for Moran's visit to the police. The girl delegated all functions to her lawyer. She looked through the forms, checking the testimony, and asked clarifying questions. There was no longer any cold, but Jong Mo-ran herself just sat there silently. But she kept her eyes on investigator Sa Jae-ha, and the man felt awkward under her gaze. It seemed to pierce his entire body and peer into his soul, leaving not the slightest corner hidden. During the entire conversation, the lawyer said nothing new. She only carefully reviewed and organized the testimony previously given by Chung Mo-ran, and the actress sat silently. The man expected that the girl had come to deal with him, but nothing in her behavior indicated this. Suddenly, she spoke. Mo-ran pushed her chair back with a creaking sound and said that she noticed something unusual. Coming close, the beauty asked an unusual question. She asked why Jae-ha had a broken cartilage in his ear. This was the last thing he expected to hear. The investigator was silent, his mouth open and his eyes wide open in amazement, and Moran asked how this happened. And suddenly, the man heard something else. In a soft and gentle voice, the beauty asked for forgiveness and said that he looked very much like one person. Investigator Jae-ha dropped his pen on the table in surprise. He was almost beginning to doubt his own sanity. The man grabbed his head with his hands, unable to understand what was happening. The thing was that the girl did not say the last phrase out loud. It sounded right in his head. Looking up, Jae-ha met young Moran's gaze. She looked at him sadly and a little demandingly, as if she was waiting for some kind of answer. But all this simply threw the man off balance. He jumped up in panic and put his hands in front of him, as if defending himself, and then the mirage dissipated. The actress calmly apologized for her interest in the investigation and for asking too many questions. After a pause, the girl added that she knew someone in the past, and his ears were exactly the same shape as investigator Jae-ha's. With a sly smile, Moran added that this brought back some memories for her. Now she seemed like an ordinary girl again, albeit a very beautiful one. But the detective could no longer keep up with such abrupt changes in her. Therefore, unable to restrain himself, he cursed. Hearing this, the female lawyer stared at him in shock. It seemed she was so shocked that she could not articulate anything. Somehow, overcoming her surprise, she said indignantly that she could not believe what she had heard. Indeed, the lawyer looked as if she might have a stroke. Seeking support, she looked at the actress, but she was still sitting calmly next to her and silent. Finally, she smiled cheerfully and quietly asked him what he had just said. She seemed to be greatly amused by the situation. At that time, Jae-ha thought that he had been different from the others. Since childhood, his height, his build, his muscles, his coordination made him special. In addition, he had a very strong immune system. Having undergone numerous examinations, the man knew that he was not afraid of almost any disease. As far back as he could remember, he had never been sick with anything. Only as a young man did Jae-ha begin to think that this was a little strange. As he grew up, he realized how different he was from other people. Sometimes it even made him think that he was not quite human. That is why conversations with a classmate friend, in which he attributed his odd behavior to overwork, irritated the young man so much. After all, he knew very well that this simply could not be. And yet, Jae-ha knew there was another person. They were too similar, but not the same. So now, when Mo Ran asked him about his broken ear, he was taken aback. No one else could know about his strange resemblance. That's why he dropped the pen, unable to control himself. The girl took him by surprise with her question. And so, the former investigator, Sa Jae-ha, an experienced policeman, clutched his head in horror. He could not bear even the thought of this man. Of course, it was very stupid. However, it was the memories of that person that gave him an idea. One assumption arose as to why the actress had come to the police station again. After all, despite the suspended investigation and the incident in the alley, the girl chatted with him quite casually. She acted as if nothing had happened. Apparently, the real reason for the movie star's visit was to show her superiority. This means that her power was incredibly great, and Jae-ha knew only one person who enjoyed his advantage in exactly the same way. But he would have given anything to never know. All these complexities and contradictions tore at the investigator's soul. His hands were clenched into fists from impotence and irritation, and his jaws seemed to be in a spasm. And then the man finally made an incredibly difficult decision for himself. He could not leave the terrible crimes alone without paying tribute to the memory of the innocent victims. Therefore, senior investigator Sa Jae-ha firmly said that actress Jung Mo-ran must undergo a monster test. This was something he himself did not expect. Hearing this, the female lawyer even opened her mouth and froze in amazement. It seemed that this option could never even come to her mind. Then Mo-ran quietly asked him again what he had just said. The detective felt a strong temptation to backtrack and say something completely different, but he immediately discarded the thought. And then suddenly, the interrogation room door swung open with a bang. Detective Dong-shik literally burst into the room. Almost shouting, he asked everyone to calm down. Jumping up to the commander, Dong-shik began to whisper and ask what was going on. He reminded him that earlier, Jae-ha had let the actress go himself. But the commander coldly replied that he had not asked anyone to come in. Few people know what a monster test was. The essence of it was that the suspect's blood was injected into a test animal, most often a rat. Then the animal had to be closely observed and wait for the result. If the animal died, covered with characteristic spots, then the test was considered positive. This was followed by the third stage. The suspect had to be eliminated physically. On paper, everything looked simple. However, there were many complications. Therefore, they resorted to the help of a few people who could identify the monster at first glance. And investigator Jae-ha was one of them. That's why he was called up to serve in the police. True, he had to sacrifice his sports career to do so. All these thoughts flashed through the detective's head like lightning. But there was no turning back, and he firmly repeated once again about the need to conduct an investigation. These words could have shocked anyone. However, the actress controlled herself well. She only raised her eyebrows in surprise and asked why her. Jae-ha stared at her. He was trying to figure out if her surprise was just acting or genuine interest. Either way, he had reasons to check. So the man calmly replied that he was responsible for this case and public opinion on it. Meanwhile, Detective Dong-shik, maddened, was rushing about behind the glass partition. The investigator continued speaking. He reported that there was some information that the actress was successfully hiding behind her money and high-ranking connections. So in her case, checking would be the best way out. It would immediately remove many assumptions and clarify the situation. As he spoke, investigator Sa Jae-ha looked closely at the actress's expression. He tried to understand her emotions and read her thoughts to confirm his case. The man knew that Mo-ran was unlikely to be the monster that killed so many people, leaving terrible marks on their bodies. However, she was certainly not an ordinary person. Of course, there was no guarantee that the analysis would shed light on its origin and essence, but it was still worth a try. And now, having made such an offer to the famous actress, the detective waited for a response. From this, he hoped to draw certain conclusions, and the star was silently meaningful, as if testing his patience. In the end, she restrainedly thanked him for such a high opinion of her, and agreed to undergo the test. This was quite unexpected. Investigator Jae-ha was almost certain that the girl would refuse under some plausible pretext. Her consent somewhat confused the cards. Then Mo-ran suddenly added that she still wanted to know something more about this procedure. She asked permission to ask a few questions in private. There was no reason for Jae-ha to refuse this conversation, and he decided that since this conversation was destined to take place, it would be safer to hold it on his territory. After some thought, the man suggested that Mo-ran go to the storeroom for a private conversation. This room had such a simple name, but it was most often used for privacy. The investigator stood up and let the girl go ahead of him, and walked out of the interrogation room. Walking next to Mo-ran, he felt an inexplicable excitement. However, upon entering the storeroom, he sighed with relief. A large video camera was looking straight at them from the ceiling with an imperturbable black eye. It gave at least a small sense of security. The detective then slowly looked around the room. At first glance, there were no objects that posed a heightened danger. Then, with his back to the actress, Jae-ha quietly unbuttoned his jacket. He had something in store in case the beauty decided to attack him right now. Besides, it was important to remember that they were not in a dark, deserted alleyway now. This was a police station, full of trained men and weapons. Only a madman would dare to attack under such circumstances. And Mo-ran, who stood meekly before him, looked quite normal. The man walked to the middle of the room and deliberately positioned himself so that he was in the camera's field of view. After a moment of silence, he asked Mo-ran what she wanted to know. The girl remained silent. Then Jae-ha suddenly thought that the actress was just stalling for time. He sternly said that he was not going to sit silently in the storeroom. Suddenly, the man felt a hot gust of air on his face. It was as if a bright flash of light had passed by him, almost touching his face. Before Jae-ha could recover, he heard something crash behind him, followed by the crackling sound of an electric discharge. It was a video camera. Just a minute ago, it was hanging from the ceiling, giving a false sense of security. And now, it was lying lifelessly on the floor, making a quiet crackling sound. Jae-ha froze, staring at the broken camera in shock. The girl behind him let out a quiet gasp of surprise. Her eyes widened in surprise. She muttered out loud that she didn't understand anything. After all, she had aimed at the man's head, but had missed. This sentence made the investigator go cold with horror. He looked at Mo-ran in panic and thought that she had gone crazy. And the girl seemed to say with regret about the pogrom. Jae-ha couldn't believe his ears. Apparently, the actress was upset that his head survived, but the camera was broken. He had seen many psychopaths in his career as a detective, but even he was surprised by the beauty's strange reaction, and she was definitely very upset about what had happened. It was something unbelievable. Clutching her head, Mo-ran lamented that if something happened in this room, no one would know. This was what made her despair. This simply did not fit into the detective's head. Now he no longer understood at all what would happen to him in the company of this strange and dangerous beauty. Seeing her move towards him, the man stepped back and ordered her not to come closer. And the actress asked him in surprise why he was moving away, and promised not to hurt her. In a soothing tone, she said that he would simply forget everything that had happened. Then a bright flash of light flashed in the air and everything went dark. Now Jae-ha was alone in complete darkness. It surrounded him on all sides and was strangely dense, almost viscous. The man tried to understand what was happening, but it did not seem like anything. Jae-ha suddenly thought that he had already died. Of course, he knew that sooner or later it would happen. However, he did not think that it would happen right now. Strange thoughts and fragments of visions began to pop up in his head. At first, the investigator thought that he should have treated Detective Dong-shik better. Then suddenly, I remembered my school friend, Kong Ming. I became incredibly curious about how his life had turned out, and after that, the man thought about his family. Although he was not particularly close to his family, he should visit them more often. And he suddenly remembered the divinely beautiful fairy. She was as perfect as the beautiful flowers she held in her hands. The last vision gave him a strange feeling. The illusion suddenly dissipated, and Jae-ha opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Mo-ran's concentrated face. Her slender, delicate hand was touching the wall next to his head, and her gaze was directed straight into his eyes. The girl looked at him inquiringly. She was standing very close now, but for some reason, she did not cause fear or anxiety. Jae-ha looked around. There were washed dishes on the table in the drying rack, and stacks of disposable cups were piled up next to them. There were many boxes of food and spices on the shelves. It was the same old pantry. There was nothing to remind him of the terrible, viscous blackness, but something had just happened, and the detective had no idea what it was. Then, having dared, he asked the beauty a question. Jae-ha asked what should have happened after that bright sparkle. After all, he did not understand at all what exactly had changed. The girl looked at him again. From her puzzled look, it was clear that something had gone wrong. She tapped his forehead again, lightly, with her fingers, figuring she should have hit him harder. There was a strange, quiet sound, but still nothing changed. The storeroom was silent. Despite the circumstances, the detective even found it a little funny to see Mo-ran's puzzled expression. She raised her hand again and began to touch his forehead with her fingers. Again and again. The strange, soft sound came again and again, but it did no harm. Senior investigator. So Jae-ha suddenly thought, inappropriately, that it was like being hit in the face by a large fluffy cat with soft, clawless paws. It was quite funny. The detective even chuckled to himself. He found these light touches so funny. But the girl's serious look discouraged him from laughing. Looking at him with regret, she quietly whispered that something had gone wrong. And for some reason, this innocent remark seriously alarmed the detective. The girl's eyes suddenly flashed with a scarlet fire. She raised her hand, causing a loud crack and a bright flash. Through her teeth, Mo-ran muttered that now he would have to be killed. Apparently, the girl seriously decided to make him keep quiet. Aiming at him with a bright glow, she said that he would die quickly and would not have time to feel anything. Covering himself with his hand, Jae-ha shouted that he shouldn't change his mood so quickly, because every person should have a golden mean. And suddenly he remembered that she wasn't even human. Now he was finally convinced of this. And he realized that she had deliberately hidden her essence under the mask of an actress. But it seemed that all these tricks simply did not work on him. Now the man knew that he simply had to get Mo-ran to confess. He loudly declared that this was a fairy in front of him, and this was her true face. Jae-ha also suddenly realized that she had caught the monster in the alley that night and neutralized it, but no one had ever been able to destroy a monster with their bare hands before. Besides, supernatural beings didn't kill each other, and only she could do it, so the beautiful Mo-ran wasn't a monster at all. While saying this, the investigator quickly dodged the actress's hands. And she, it seemed, did not listen at all, and was still trying to grab him. Suddenly, the man realized that he had to get something out of his inside pocket. However, it was simply impossible to do this now. Then he suddenly rushed towards Mo-ran and grabbed her in his arms. Jae-ha tried to hold the girl back, even though she was quite strong. And suddenly, he heard her quiet whisper. His eyes widened in surprise. After all, the beauty had whispered for some reason that she had finally found him. Meanwhile, Detective Dong-shik and his colleague were walking down the hallway towards the storeroom. Dong-shik said that the actress came by herself, but Jae-ha didn't react to it. And then investigator Sa Jae-ha felt that the girl herself pressed herself tightly against him. The only thought that flashed through his head was that she had done this in vain. He thought that he was right after all, and the beautiful Mo-ran really was a fairy. And at that time, she happily looked at his face and repeated again that she had finally found it. At that moment, the pantry door creaked softly and opened. Detective Dong-shik and his colleague were standing on the threshold. They were deep in conversation, but suddenly fell silent mid-sentence. Indeed, the police were met with an unexpected sight. In a deserted storeroom in the middle of the workday, senior investigator Jae-ha was hugging witness Mo-ran. For a moment, the men froze on the threshold, their eyes like saucers and expressing extreme astonishment. But a second later, both of them rushed out of the room. The door slammed behind them. From behind the door, only surprised cries could be heard. The police officers asked each other if they had really just seen Jung Mo-ran and Commander Sa Jae-ha together. After exchanging excited remarks, both agreed that the boss was having an affair with the witness. This made Jae-ha rush to the exit to explain everything. However, the girl had no intention of letting him go. She gripped his jacket sleeve tightly with her fingers and looked into his eyes demandingly. Then the man pulled harder. The beauty's fingers slipped off the sleeve. However, at the last moment, she managed to grab him by the collar of his jacket. The investigator struggled to get away, but Mo-ran held on very tightly. And then Jae-ha remembered something. As soon as he entered the storeroom, he prudently unbuttoned his jacket. This was not done without reason. The detective had prepared something for an emergency. Apparently, he stepped on it. The man stopped struggling, dropped his hands, and made a quick movement, twisting out of the jacket. It became clear that he was wearing a shoulder holster with a revolver underneath. The girl froze in place, clutching her empty jacket in her hands. She looked at the investigator with bewilderment, and he stood in a tense pose, as if he couldn't decide what to do next. The seconds flew by, but no one moved. Thoughts flashed through his head, and then Jae-ha came to his senses. He remembered what his duty was, and he was going to do it. There was a rustling sound. If it weren't for that, the detective's subtle hand movement might not have been noticed. But in a moment, he was already standing in front of the girl. Only now, a revolver was shining in his hand, and the barrel was aimed right at the center of Mo-ran's forehead. A couple of minutes earlier, standing opposite the actress, the detective was feverishly trying to find a way out. Thoughts flashed in mad flashes one after another. Jae-ha had long since been unable to imagine his work without a weapon. However, now he had a revolver with him, and not a stun gun like in the alley. And the insidious fairy might not like it at all. He had already seen the helpless stun gun fly off and the broken camera explode. The revolver was in the holster, and if the fairy decided to blow it up too, then the first to suffer would be Jae-ha himself. One could try to lie that the revolver was needed just in case. However, then the angry actress would be able to kill the investigator too, just in case. In any case, the girl was seriously determined to silence the man. And if erasing his memory didn't work, the only thing left to do was kill him. Jae-ha knew that any attempt to defend himself would be futile, so he decided to take a risk and attack the deadly beauty openly. That's why he immediately drew his revolver and pointed it at Mo-ran. At the same time, the man said that it didn't matter whether she was a fairy or a monster. However, causing harm to a person was punishable by death. Therefore, the star beauty had only one choice. And now, senior investigator Jae-ha was demanding that the one he thought was a fairy justify herself. He needed to get proof that she didn't do it. He pressed the barrel to her forehead, and his finger was on the trigger. But the girl looked at him calmly and even a little mockingly. Suddenly, she smiled. The detective's heart went cold with a bad feeling, and Mo-ran calmly said that in order to fire a bullet, all you need to do is pull the trigger. She placed her slender fingers on Jae-ha's hand and pressed lightly. The movement caused him to pull the trigger, which immediately clicked loudly. The girl did it again, and again. The trigger continued to click obediently, but there were no shots. The detective was taken aback. He knew for sure that his weapon was in perfect working order, and the actress just smiled cheerfully, watching his bewilderment. He squeezed the revolver tighter and tighter, and the girl even suggested that he not lose hope. It was a very strange scene. A tall, strong man, the embodiment of power and masculinity, and a graceful, slender girl, striking in her beauty and fragility. But the forces were unequal. Realizing this, the detective dropped his hand helplessly. He turned away, unable to overcome his disappointment and resentment. The revolver was still clutched in his hopelessly hanging hand. It no longer had any purpose. It was just a useless piece of metal now. The man, like a beaten dog, walked back to the table and stood with his back to the wall. And Mo-ran asked again if he was going to shoot. Jae-ha just waved his hand helplessly and put the revolver back in the holster. Then the girl noticed that he was weaker than he seemed. Or maybe he was able to find an excuse for her. She mocked him with a grin, ordering her to prove something to him. But now all this was no longer important. The man understood that no bullet was scary to her at all. And then he threw in her face what he had already realized. She really was not a human being, but a fairy. This was her true face. Like any fairy, she had truly limitless power. Therefore, she was sure that the monster could not harm her and beat him to death. Immediately after this, the girl entered into a fight with the detective. And even, not being afraid of the police, she injured his hand. In the finale, Mo-ran even calmly put herself under the gun and endured it at her forehead. Simply because she knew that she could not die. Because she was not human. All this spoke of only one thing. There was nothing and no one who could pose a threat to her. And it was definitely not investigator Jae-ha. After all, the actress's body was just a shell for the fairy, and the girl confirmed all this. She said that she did not feel pain, just as if her clothes were just being torn. And, turning around, she approached the detective again. He stood there motionless, and Moran only carefully buttoned his jacket so that the holster wouldn't be visible. After that, she promised that she wouldn't touch him again. Jae-ha twitched nervously. He asked bitterly how he could be calm when she had done so much, and then calmly showed up at the police station. This seemed to upset the beauty. She only asked the man not to get too angry when he had a loaded revolver at his side. Then she turned and was about to leave the room, and only dropped that she was worried about him, although it was hard to believe. Clicking her heels towards the exit, the girl said one last thing. Moran advised Jae-ha not to get angry, but to try to look at everything from a different angle. After all, according to her, the answer was right in front of him. However, it was covered by a veil of anger that prevented him from understanding the obvious. The investigator stood in a stupor, trying to comprehend her words. And the girl even dropped a promise to reimburse the cost of the broken camera at the next meeting. Already at the door, looking over her shoulder, she added that they would definitely see each other again. And then the door slammed shut. Everything went quiet. So Jae-ha felt strange. He remembered how long ago, when he was 4 years old, he asked his father a question. The little boy was interested in what a tsunami was. He then watched a video about disasters and became interested. The father explained to the child that this was a very, very big wave fraught with great danger. The boy couldn't understand what was so scary about ordinary water. Then his father explained that this wave originates very deep in the sea. It is usually caused by an underwater earthquake. And now, rumors have quietly started to circulate in the central police station about Commander Sa Jae-ha and Jung Mo-ran. And just as a wave rises in the sea after an earthquake and becomes higher and higher, so the rumors began to spread more and more. The embrace in the pantry became public knowledge. Then the wave grows, approaching the land. And the rumors grew. Now many believed that Jae-ha and Mo-ran were together even before the ceremony. So the detective saved his girlfriend from the investigation. The wave was getting stronger and more destructive as it approached, and rumors were already spreading that Commander Sa had sent Mo-ran to be checked only because they had quarreled. Finally, when people encounter a wave, it becomes a real tragedy, and so the tsunami of rumors attacked Jae-ha, plunging him into the darkness of hopelessness and melancholy. The detective could think of nothing but a closed investigation. Realizing the hopelessness and destructive effect of rumors, he even wanted to quit. After all, no matter how much he tried to refute the speculation, no one listened to him. There was no point in justifying himself anymore. Now the man suddenly understood the words of the chief that the crowd wanted the monster to be not an ordinary person, but a famous actress. And now, everyone was just having fun. And the only one to blame for all this was the star beauty. After all, she showed up precisely to turn everything upside down. She came to the police station, attracting everyone's attention. Then she hung around the detective, courting him from all sides. Perhaps the rumors about their relationship were also beneficial to the actress. After all, people were now saying that the leader of the anti-monster squad and Jung Mo-ran were dating, which meant that she was still human, no matter what anyone suspected. The rumors spread like wildfire, fast and unstoppable. And now no one believed Sa Jae-ha's words. Everything had turned against him, and the man no longer knew how to work in such an atmosphere. He had to decide what to do with the Ma Hee-yeon murder case. After all, he couldn't just forget about it. In addition, he couldn't forget Mo-ran's last words that they would definitely meet again. This could mean that the deadly beauty would find him again, and then any weapon would again be powerless against her power. Although Mo-ran had promised that she would not touch Jae-ha, but how could he believe her after all this? All these thoughts, like sharp needles, pricked the detective's soul and mind. From his experiences, he felt a strange weakness and even nausea. The man tried to understand why all this happened to him. After all, he had coped well and steadfastly endured all the trials. But after the appearance of this girl, everything turned upside down. Depressed and exhausted, the detective sat alone at his desk. In this state, he could only sort through papers and file old documents. His appearance was so uninviting that even his subordinates tried to avoid his desk and avoid being seen. Only the faithful Don Shik hung around nearby. Perhaps he was the only person who was more affected by this story than Jae-ha. The young detective was even more depressed. Although the commander had already told him several times that he was not really dating Mo-ran, the young man did not believe him completely. He kept whining that the couple looked too good together. The investigator tried to remind him that he had met the actress for the first time just a few days ago, and that all this had happened in front of Dong-shik's eyes. He believed her, but still suffered. After the scene in the interrogation room, it even seemed to him that the boss had no reason to dislike the movie star. After all, it was then that he offered the girl to undergo a monster test. Dong-shik tried his best to pull himself together. He even brought the report he found about last year's case to his boss. It should have been dealt with a long time ago. After leafing through the papers, Jae-ha became seriously alarmed. Apparently, the report described new crimes that threatened yet another threat to humanity. Dong-shik confirmed that this was happening more and more often. Therefore, he suggested to the boss that if he was free from his current work, he should still take up this matter. Noticing the investigator's surprise, the detective explained that recently all the employees had been sitting idle at their workstations. No new cases had appeared. Jae-ha was genuinely surprised. Busy with his own worries and attempts to protect himself from the domineering fairy, he completely ignored what was happening around him. The tossing and turning between guilt, duty, and the desire to survive took too much of the man's attention and energy. That's why he didn't even notice the strange lull in his work. And it was quite strange. Humanity had not changed for centuries, so it was not worth expecting that crimes would suddenly stop being committed, especially since no one had been catching monsters lately. The special department staff were hanging around idle, and the fairy was busy with the detective. It seemed that the monsters were also on New Year's holidays, or some unknown forces suddenly stood up to protect people. And then something began to clear up in Jae-ha's mind. He suddenly remembered Mo-ran's words. She kept hinting that only a veil of anger prevented the brave policeman from seeing the obvious right under his nose. But the solution was indeed on the surface. Trembling with excitement, the investigator jumped to his feet. He asked Dong-shik to repeat everything he had just said. He was even frightened by this passionate suddenness, but repeated it. And then the shocked Jae-ha remembered his father's story about the tsunami. The boy asked how he could escape, but his father explained that it was impossible to escape. The wave was moving too fast. However, over the years, people realized that such dangerous things should be nipped in the bud. They studied and researched the terrible forces, and yet, it turned out that the only thing that could save the land from the tsunami was breakwaters. The deadly wave had to be broken up and weakened, and then, with the help of extraterrestrial powers, they began to build barriers. Spirits helped people to save humanity. After all, only spirits can overcome planetary-scale disasters and calamities. And fairies. Then it turned out that Mo-ran really wasn't a human, but he wasn't a monster either. She seemed like a criminal to the investigator, who was angry about the crimes. But at that time, a real deity was hiding under the image of a fairy. Thoughts were racing through Jae-ha's feverish head. He couldn't grasp their essence, but he felt that he was already close to solving the mystery. Of course, it was hard for him to believe that a deity could have such an unbearable character. And the fact that Mo-ran came to this world in the form of an actress seemed strange. Realizing that he was confused, he slammed his palm on the table with all his might. Dong-shik even jumped from surprise and fear. He looked at the chief with alarm, trying to understand what had come into his bright head this time. And Jae-ha reported that an unexpected idea had come to his mind. The man decided that he had to meet Chung Mo-ran again. He wanted to try to verify his suspicions somehow. Dong-shik stared at his boss in bewilderment. He still couldn't get used to the fact that his mood changed faster than the weather outside. Just recently, the investigator didn't want to hear about the flighty actress, and now he insists on a personal meeting. Besides, Dong-shik didn't like the dreamy expression on his boss's face. He demanded that the chief issue Mo-ran an official summons, but Jae-ha calmed the detective down. He explained that he had something important to tell her, but it should not be on record. To finally calm the jealous Dong-shik down, the investigator said something else. He declared that the actress was not his type at all. It just so happened that the police station was silent at the time, so Jae-ha's words sounded unexpectedly loud. And now, shocked eyes of the officers were looking at him from every corner. Don Schick calmed down a bit and got over the first overwhelming impression. And after that, he said that he did have one idea. The detective suggested going to Haebin Hospital, where all the bodies of people infected with the virus were sent for treatment within 3 days. Ma Hee-yeon's body was also there. The young actress's funeral was scheduled for the following day, and if Jong Mo-ran wants to say goodbye to her colleague, she will come to the funeral, so it will be possible to meet her tomorrow. Indeed, the actress thought exactly that way. Before leaving, she smoked another cigarette to calm down and be completely unperturbed. As she left the house, the girl noticed a huge crowd of reporters hoping for a photo or an interview. She deliberately got into a car they knew and opened the window a little so that they would notice her. After all, Mo-ran knew that attending her colleague's funeral would improve society's opinion of her. The sad face and black clothes were meant to show people the sorrow of her senior friend. Taking another drag on her cigarette, the girl thought that the monsters were just weak sacks of flesh and bones. One blow was enough to knock the wind out of them. The car started moving, and after a while, it drove up to a small, neat chapel. All the walls were covered with many wreaths with words of regret for the loss. In the middle of the hall, on a large pedestal, stood a beautiful portrait of Ma Hee-yeon. The girl in it looked so beautiful and radiant that it became unbearably painful to know about her death. Mo-ran stood at a distance for a while, collecting her thoughts. Then she walked up to the pedestal and placed another white chrysanthemum on it. There were already quite a few of them, and each one signified someone's sorrow. Suddenly, she heard voices. Turning around, the actress noticed investigator Jae-ha and Dong-sik. They were just talking to the inconsolable parents of the deceased. They were very upset that the investigation was closed. After all, the police were constantly faced with hundreds of crimes. And for the parents, their daughter was the only joy in life. The crying mother and grieving father looked at the detectives with hope. They asked if there was really nothing more that could be done to catch the killer. But they had no answer. The parents held hands. The policeman's silence told them more than words. Squeezing her husband's hand, the woman burst into tears again, and then Jae-ha made his final decision. He knew what risks he was taking, and what problems this could cause for him and for other people. However, he moved along the corridor in search of the beautiful Mo-ran. Now, seeing the inconsolable broken parents who had lost their only daughter, he was already completely sure. He simply had to meet her and convince her not only not to kill him because of the memories, but also to do something much more important. Standing before the beautiful girl, the investigator imagined for a moment what a powerful force was contained in this fragile body. And he told her that now he knew for sure. Star actress Jung Mo-ran was a true deity. He was absolutely certain. And if that was really the case, then Jae-ha only asked her for one thing. He asked Mo-ran to save all of humanity, and himself. Because of this nightmare, his life had changed completely, and it could never be the same again. Jae-ha stood in front of the girl and waited anxiously for her answer. Everything inside him was vibrating with unbearable tension. The man knew that it was better to show his weakness, but save people. However, to his surprise, he did not notice any warmth on Mo-ran's face. The girl looked at him with displeasure, and even a little arrogantly. When she finally spoke, every word dripped with contempt. The actress assumed that the brave investigator had become a stalker and was now simply following her. It was offensive, but Jae-ha remained silent. He only replied that he really wanted to talk to her, and the girl retorted that this was the second time she had caught him doing this. Blushing, the detective realized she was talking about the scene in the alley where he had appeared completely unexpectedly. Now he hastened to explain that he simply lived nearby and had heard the screams. Mo-ran then chuckled softly and replied that she knew where Jae-ha lived. Considering who she was, it was only natural. However, now the actress looked like an ordinary person, so her answer came as a complete surprise to the man. He hesitated, collecting his thoughts. Then the girl herself asked what he wanted to talk about, and then she added that the place and time for the conversation were not very well chosen. Mo-ran was going to say goodbye to the deceased, so she suggested waiting for her at the machine. Without waiting for an answer, the girl turned around and quickly left. And Jae-ha was left wondering whether she was spying on him or if it was all an accident. After all, he himself was standing at the machine before coming. But there was nothing to be done. the man walked to the exit and stopped at the designated place. From there, he called Dong-shik. He was nowhere to be seen, but the detective answered the call immediately. Dong-shik said he was about to leave. Then Jae-ha told him that the actress had agreed to talk. It could take a long time, so the boss sent the detective home and stayed to wait for the girl. Even though everything was going according to plan, the investigator was a little nervous. So, to be on the safe side, he asked Dong-shik to immediately report to the police if he did not answer the phone within an hour. Before he could finish speaking, Jae-ha heard Mo-ran's voice. She was already standing next to him and offering to talk in the parking lot. Wondering how much the girl had managed to hear from the conversation, the man nevertheless asked the detective not to forget about his request. After all, the suspicions had not completely dissipated. Following the beauty to the parking lot, Jae-ha hesitated. He even asked if he should be wary of reporters who might interfere with the conversation. But the girl confidently walked forward. She merely tossed over her shoulder that he need not worry about it. She was going to make sure no one saw her. This once again astounded the detective. Following the actress, investigator saw Jae-ha came to an underground parking lot. It was half full of cars, but there really were no people in sight. Mo-ran opened the door of the elegant scarlet car and invited the man to sit and talk inside. He hesitated and even asked if it was necessary. The girl shrugged and said there was no better place, and she told him to just leave if he was not happy with something. The investigator's face showed doubt. Having finally made up his mind, the man sat inside and slammed the door. He didn't quite know how to act and only felt that he was starting to get scared, just like he had been in the pantry. However, Mo-ran pretended not to notice his anxiety and suggested that they get comfortable. After a moment of silence, she asked what he wanted to talk about. Smiling slightly, the beauty added that she had already thought that the brave detective was afraid of her. This was not surprising after the blows with which the fairy wanted to erase his memory. Jae-ha didn't respond to this, but he said that he really looked at things from a slightly different angle, and yet he understood why she was in the alley back then. The actress was wearing that same noticeable dress from the ceremony, but despite this, she still killed that monster in the alley. And most likely, he was the real killer of Ma Hee-young. Hearing this, Mo-ran nodded her head slightly and smiled. She praised Jae-ha and only asked why he could guess this earlier. Without waiting for an answer, the girl assumed that the detective now wanted to know whether his assumptions were true. However, Jae-ha replied that he had one request. Concentrating, the man said that usually a whole armed squad is involved in catching a monster. But despite this, operations often fail, and the monster manages to escape. This poses a serious problem. Jae-ha paused, remembering the portrait of the deceased Ma Hee-yeon. The girl was too young and beautiful to die so early, so the fact that the monsters were able to escape meant that soon someone else would die. And the feeling of helplessness was unbearable. Looking at Mo-ran, the detective quietly said that he had seen her in action, and he was absolutely sure that she could kill a monster, even just by strangling it with the collar of her shirt. Here, the girl suddenly interrupted him. She confidently declared that she knew exactly what he wanted to say. Senior investigator Sei. Jae-ha gritted his teeth in excitement. This was the decisive moment that could either save or destroy everyone. He exhaled as if he had suddenly dove into cold water and quickly asked the girl if she was a deity. Silence reigned in the car. Mo-ran's eyes became thoughtful. This strange man truly thought of her as a deity, but she remembered how, long ago, someone terrible had held her tightly, mocking her. He had called her a simple girl, and forbidden her to even think that she was something. But now, many years later, the man sitting next to her asked for her help. The girl saw that he was afraid of her. Therefore, she understood how difficult it was for him to force himself to overcome this fear. And Jae-ha continued to speak. He apologized for pointing a gun at her, and he was ready to find out what he could offer in exchange for helping and saving people. The man even hesitantly suggested that it might be money. But Mo-ran immediately declared that money had never been a problem for her. The detective then sheepishly remarked that her identity would have to be hidden, keeping the operation secret. The girl cheerfully replied that no one would have believed him anyway. Jae-ha was a little surprised. He didn't think that the actress wouldn't want to get some more fame for helping the police and helping to capture the monsters. But Mo-ran didn't need that at all. The detective was at a dead end. He couldn't even imagine what else he could offer this amazing woman to persuade her to cooperate, and she smiled and squeezed her thin fingers on the steering wheel. Squinting, the girl announced that she simply really liked this idea, and she continued that she still wanted to get something as a reward. It was something much better than money, fame, and all that. Jae-ha looked at her questioningly. Then Moran turned her head and looked him straight in the eyes. After a moment of silence, the girl asked if he would go on a date with her.